The engines went silent at exactly 9:55 in the morning, all 100 of them at once. Dorothy Callahan sat frozen in the courthouse hallway, listening to boots, dozens, then 100 pairs, climbing the steps behind her in complete silence. These were the men her son had blamed for her grandson's death, the men the whole town crossed the street to avoid. And they had come to fight for her, not against her. 3 weeks earlier, a judge had been ready to declare her unfit for sleeping beside a grave every single night for 7 months straight. Nobody in that courtroom yet knew about the letter folded in her coat pocket, the one her dead grandson had written and never sent, that was about to silence every person who had ever judged her. The frost came early to Nashville that October, settling over Rosewood Memorial Cemetery like a held breath. By 6 in the morning, when Nathan Pierce arrived to unlock the gates, he already knew what he would find. He always did. Dorothy Callahan sat wrapped in a wool blanket beside a modest granite headstone near the eastern fence line, her back against the cold stone, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She looked smaller each time he saw her, as if the nights were slowly wearing her down to nothing, 1 degree of cold at a time. "Morning, Mrs. Callahan," Nathan said, the way he said it every single day, his breath fogging in the pale light. "Morning, Nathan." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she folded the blanket into a neat practice square. He didn't ask why anymore. He'd asked the first few weeks back in the spring, standing exactly where he stood now with his rake in one hand and worry creasing his forehead. She had simply said, "I made a promise," and nothing more. That was 7 months ago. 7 months of Dorothy walking the half-mile from her house on Chester Avenue every evening at dusk, carrying her blanket and a thermos of coffee, and sleeping beside her grandson's grave until sunrise, rain or frost, or the occasional gentle October evening that fooled no one into thinking winter wasn't coming. Nathan had watched her arrive that first night in March, uncertain, sitting stiffly upright against the stone as though she expected someone to tell her to leave. By April, she had brought a cushion. By June, a proper blanket. By September, she had stopped flinching every time a car slowed on the road beyond the fence. The town had opinions about it. Nashville was not so large that a 74-year-old widow sleeping among the dead could go unnoticed. The Chester Avenue Facebook group had entire threads devoted to her, 30 and 40 comments deep. Some called it heartbreaking, a grandmother's love that refused to end at the grave. Others called it a scandal, a sign of a woman losing her grip on reality, an embarrassment to a respectable street lined with tidy lawns and porch lights. A few had phoned the police, worried she'd freeze to death out there alone in the dark, or worse, that someone might take advantage of a lone, elderly woman in an unlit cemetery after hours. Dorothy paid none of it any mind, or at least she told herself she didn't. She had buried her husband, Walter, 30 years ago, a slow death from lung disease that had taught her patience with grief. She had buried her only grandson 11 months ago, a death so sudden and so violent that no amount of patience had prepared her for it. Grief, she had learned in the years between those 2 funerals, did not care what the neighbors thought, and it did not keep a schedule that made sense to anyone standing outside of it. Tyler Callahan's headstone read simply, "Tyler James Callahan, beloved son and grandson, 2005-2024. There was no mention of how he died, no mention of the motorcycle that had gone off Briley Parkway on a rain-slicked curve just past midnight, no mention of the leather vest he'd been wearing when the paramedics found him, its patches soaked through with rain and worse. Richard, Dorothy's son, and Tyler's father had insisted on that omission. He hadn't wanted any part of that world carved into permanent stone, as if erasing it from the marker might erase it from what had happened. Richard had not visited the grave once since the funeral. Dorothy knew this because she was there every single night, and he never was. She thought about him often as she sat there, her son who had once been a gentle, uncertain boy himself, before life and disappointment had hardened him into a man who mistook control for love. She didn't blame him, not entirely. He had lost his wife to cancer when Tyler was 9, and grief had made him afraid, and fear had made him rigid, and rigidity had cost him his only son long before Briley Parkway ever did. Dorothy walked home that particular morning past the Coffee Cup Diner on Gallatin Pike, where she caught Deputy Wallace watching her through the window, his coffee halfway to his mouth, his expression the particular blend of pity and suspicion she'd grown used to over the months. He was young, not much older than Tyler would have been, and she suspected he didn't quite know what to do with an old woman who broke small rules for reasons that weren't his to understand. She lifted her chin and kept walking, her joints aching with every step, the wool blanket rolled tight beneath her arm. She was not ashamed. She had made a promise to her grandson, and Dorothy Callahan did not break promises, no matter what it cost her. What it was costing her, she didn't yet fully understand, or perhaps she understood it perfectly well and simply refused to weigh it against what she owed Tyler. Her hip ached constantly now, a deep grinding pain that no amount of ibuprofen quite touched. Her doctor, Dr. Ferris, a kind woman with silver-streaked hair who had known Dorothy for over a decade, had mentioned gently during her last appointment that sleeping outdoors in October in Tennessee was not something a woman her age should be doing, that her blood pressure was elevated, that her body needed rest in an actual bed with actual warmth. Her son had mentioned it less gently in a phone call 3 weeks earlier that had ended with him saying words she still heard at night, replaying them the way she used to replay Walter's laugh in the years just after he passed. "You're an old woman losing her mind over a boy who threw his life away on those animals. I'm not going to watch you die out there too, Mom. I've already buried one person I love this year. I won't do it twice." She hadn't answered him. What was there to say to a man so certain of his own grief that he couldn't see hers? She'd hung up the phone, sat in her kitchen for a long while with her hands folded on the table, and then gone to the cemetery that evening. Same as always, same as she would go every evening after, no matter how many phone calls came. What Dorothy didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she was not the only person watching over Tyler's grave in those quiet months. Twice a week, sometimes more, a man on a motorcycle rode slowly past the eastern fence line after dark, cut his engine near the tree line so as not to disturb her, and sat astride his bike in the shadows, watching the small, huddled shape of an old woman keeping vigil beside a boy he had loved like a son of his own. His name was Curtis Bradshaw, and for 11 months he had been trying to work up the courage to speak to her, turning the idea over and over in his mind the way a man turns over a decision he's afraid might make things worse instead of better. Every time he got close enough to call out to her, something stopped him, the fear that she'd see the leather and the patches and the years of road behind his eyes, and see only the thing the town had already decided he was. Curtis Bradshaw had been president of the Steel Wardens Motorcycle Club for 19 years, and in that time he had buried 4 brothers. Men who had ridden beside him through decades of Tennessee summers and winters, men whose funerals he had organized, whose mothers he had comforted, whose memories lived permanently in the scarred leather of his vest. None of those losses had settled into his chest quite the way Tyler's had, and it had taken Curtis most of a year to understand why. Tyler had come to them at 17, skinny and quiet, showing up at the clubhouse on Dickerson Pike on a cold February evening because his father had thrown him out for the 3rd time in as many months. Richard Callahan hadn't approved of much about his son. Not his grades, which were average at best, not his friends, most of whom Richard considered a bad influence, not the way Tyler flinched at raised voices, a habit left over from a childhood spent absorbing his father's grief and anger in equal measure, and certainly not the fact that Tyler would rather spend an afternoon with his hands buried in an engine than follow his father into the family's insurance business. a path Richard had mapped out for him since before he could walk. When Tyler found the Steel Wardens, quite by accident, wandering into their annual charity poker run while looking for somewhere to disappear for an afternoon, he found something he'd never had at home. People who didn't ask him to be anyone other than who he was. The club didn't make him a full member. He was too young, and Curtis had strict rules about that, rules he never bent no matter how much a kid begged. But they made him a prospect, taught him to ride on the empty back roads outside the city, taught him to fix a carburetor blindfolded, gave him a bunk at the clubhouse on the nights when things at home got bad enough that he couldn't stomach going back. Tyler used to say, half joking, but with something true underneath the joke, that the Steel Wardens were the only family that had ever actually shown up for him. Curtis remembered the night Tyler said it, sitting on the clubhouse porch steps with a wrench in his hand and grease up to his elbows, grinning in a way Curtis rarely saw him grin anywhere else. Then came the rain, the curve on Briley Parkway, and a phone call at 1:47 in the morning that Curtis Bradshaw would never fully recover from as long as he lived. At the funeral, held at a small Methodist church on the north side of town, Richard Callahan had stood at the front and refused to let a single member of the club sit in the first 10 rows, directing an usher to redirect them toward the back with a coldness that Curtis still felt in his chest when he thought about it. He'd told a reporter from the local paper in an interview that ran 2 days later that the motorcycle club had gotten his son killed, a quote that ran in bold print above the fold and did more damage to the Steel Wardens standing in Nashville than 20 years of community fundraisers, veteran support drives, and Christmas toy runs for foster kids ever could undo. Curtis hadn't fought it. What was there to say? A boy was dead. A father needed somewhere to put his grief, and the club was an easy target. Leather vests, loud engines, tattoos, a name that made people cross the street or clutch their purses a little tighter. Nobody wanted to hear that the club had loved Tyler more consistently, more patiently than his own father ever had. Nobody wanted to hear that Tyler had been the one who insisted on riding that night against Curtis's own advice, because he'd promised a girl he was seeing that he'd make it to her birthday dinner across town. Promise-keeping being, it turned out, something Tyler had inherited directly from his grandmother. So Curtis had stayed away from the funeral, standing instead in the parking lot of a gas station a half-mile from the church, watching the procession pass in his rear-view mirror, and he'd stayed away from the family entirely in the months that followed, and instead started visiting the grave alone, at night, when no one from town would see him, and start more rumors about menacing bikers desecrating a cemetery. That was how he'd first noticed her. An old woman, sitting against the headstone like she belonged to the ground itself, night after night, in every kind of weather Tennessee could produce. Humid August evenings, thick with mosquitoes, the first cold snaps of autumn, nights when thunder rolled low over the hills, and she still didn't leave. It was Nathan Pierce, the cemetery caretaker, who finally told him who she was, on an evening in late September when Curtis had lingered a little too long at the gate. "That's the boy's grandmother," Nathan said, leaning on his rake near the tool shed, while Curtis idled his bike just outside the fence, engine rumbling low. "Dorothy Callahan. Been coming every night since spring, near as I can tell. Whole street thinks she's lost her mind. Sheriff's departments had complaints filed against her, if you can believe that. An old woman grieving her grandson, and folks are calling it in like she's a public nuisance. Her own son's trying to get her declared unfit, from what I hear through the grapevine. Wants to move her into some assisted living facility over in Brentwood before winter really sets in." Curtis sat with that for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled beneath him. Why's she out there? What's she waiting for? Don't rightly know. She just says she made a promise, and that's all anybody's gotten out of her. Nathan shrugged, adjusting his grip on the rake. Poor woman's going to catch pneumonia before Thanksgiving if the cold don't break her hip first. I've offered her coffee from my thermos more times than I can count. She always says, "Thank you kindly," and never takes it. Proud woman. Curtis rode home that night with something heavy sitting behind his ribs, something he couldn't shake loose, no matter how fast he took the back roads. He thought about Tyler, 17 years old, sitting on the clubhouse porch and saying nobody had ever just shown up for him before. He thought about an old woman freezing on the ground because she'd made a promise to a boy the whole town had already decided to forget, reduced in most conversations to a cautionary tale about bad influences and motorcycles. He called a meeting at the clubhouse the next evening. 40 members packed into the main room, leather and cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of concern that always preceded Curtis laying out something serious. "There's a woman sleeping on Tyler's grave every night," Curtis told them, standing at the head of the long table where club business had been decided for 2 decades. Tyler's grandmother, Dorothy Callahan. She's 74 years old, and the town's about to lock her away in a facility for it, and I think... He paused, searching for words that wouldn't come out sounding softer than he meant them. "I think we're the only people in this whole city who might actually understand why she's out there." Russell Doyle, his vice president for 15 years and the closest thing Curtis had to a brother left living, leaned forward with his arms crossed, his grey beard catching the overhead light. "Curtis, you know how this looks. Boy's own father blamed us for his death, told a reporter as much, and it made the paper. We show up around his grandmother, uninvited, and it's a headline waiting to happen. Motorcycle gang harasses grieving widow at cemetery. You know exactly how the Tennessean would run that story. We're not going to harass her," Curtis said, his voice steady but firm. "We're going to ask her what she needs, quietly. One man, no colors on display if that's what it takes, no engines revving up to the fence. I'm not asking this club to make a spectacle. I'm asking us to do what we've always done when one of our own is hurting, except this time it's Tyler's family instead of one of us directly." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that meant people were thinking hard rather than arguing. Outside, the temperature was already dropping toward the mid-30s, and somewhere across town, Dorothy Callahan was walking to the cemetery with her blanket folded under her arm, unaware that the decision being made in a clubhouse on Dickerson Pike was about to change the rest of her life, and quite possibly theirs as well. Deputy Wallace, meanwhile, had made a decision of his own, one considerably less compassionate. Enough complaints had piled up on his desk from Chester Avenue residents that he intended to cite her for trespassing after posted cemetery hours first thing that week, whether the old woman liked it or not, department policy being department policy regardless of the circumstances behind it. Curtis approached her 3 nights later, alone, on foot, leaving his motorcycle parked well outside the fence on a side street so the sound of the engine wouldn't startle her or draw the wrong kind of attention from any patrol car passing by. Dorothy heard his boots on the gravel path before she saw him, the crunch of deliberate, careful footsteps, and her first instinct, when a large man in a leather vest emerged from the dark beyond the tree line, was fear, sharp and immediate. She gripped the edge of her blanket and started to rise, her heart hammering against her ribs, thinking of every warning her son had ever given her about the world after dark. "Ma'am, please. I'm not here to bother you." Curtis stopped several yards away and lifted both hands, palms open, the universal gesture of a man trying not to seem like a threat. "My name's Curtis Bradshaw. I run the Steel Wardens over on Dickerson Pike. I knew your grandson. I knew Tyler." Something shifted in Dorothy's face, the fear receding just slightly, replaced by something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the particular ache of hearing her grandson's name spoken by a stranger with real feeling behind it. "You're one of them," she said quietly, sitting back down slowly, though her hand didn't fully release its grip on the blanket. "One of the men my son blames for what happened." "Yes, ma'am. I suppose I am." Curtis didn't try to defend himself or argue the point. He simply stood there, letting the truth of it sit in the cold night air between them. She studied him for a long moment, the way she might study a stranger's story before deciding whether to believe it, her eyes moving over the patches on his vest, the grey in his beard, the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of more grief than she'd expected to find in a man his size. "Tyler talked about a man named Curtis," she said finally. "More than once, actually. Said he taught him to rebuild an engine from nothing but scrap parts. Said he was the first person who ever told him he was good at something, that he had real hands for it, better than most men twice his age." Curtis felt his throat tighten, an ache he hadn't expected to feel standing in a cemetery at 9 o'clock at night. "He was good at a lot of things, ma'am. Best set of hands I ever trained, and I've trained a lot of young men over the years. He had patience for it. Most kids his age don't." Dorothy's eyes filled, and for the first time in 11 months she let someone besides Nathan Pierce see her cry, the tears coming quiet and steady rather than the controlled composure she'd maintained for everyone else, including her own son. Curtis sat down on the cold ground, a respectful distance away, not too close, and let her cry without trying to fill the silence with anything else. Over the following 2 weeks, he returned 4 more times, always alone, always on foot from the side street. He brought a folding camp chair with a real cushion, which Dorothy refused at first with a stubborn shake of her head, and then quietly accepted on his 3rd visit, when the cold had gotten into her bones badly enough that pride took a back seat to comfort. He brought coffee in a thermos twice the size of hers, sharing it in paper cups he kept in his saddlebag. He never asked her to leave the grave, and he never pushed her to explain the promise she kept mentioning in passing. Not until the night she finally told him herself, unprompted, her voice steadier than it had been on any of their previous visits. "I got a call the night before the funeral," Dorothy said, staring at the headstone, her hands folded in her lap. "It was Tyler's number that showed up on my phone, but it wasn't him, of course. It was one of your men, young fellow, said his name was Pete, said he'd found Tyler's phone in the jacket pocket at the clubhouse and thought the family should have his things back before the service." Curtis remembered. Pete Alvarez had been the one to clean out Tyler's bunk that terrible week, folding his few belongings with a gentleness that had surprised even Curtis. "There was a letter in that jacket," Dorothy continued, her voice dropping lower. "Folded up small, tucked into an inside pocket where I don't think anybody was meant to find it right away. Tyler had written it a few months before he died. Never sent it, never gave it to anybody. I think he meant to give it to his father someday, when he was brave enough, or maybe when things between them got better instead of worse." She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a worn, creased piece of paper, soft as cloth from being read 100 times over 11 long months. She didn't hand it to Curtis. She read it aloud instead, her voice breaking on nearly every line, the words clearly memorized long before she ever needed to look down at the page. "Dad, I know you think the club ruined me, but they're the first people who ever waited up for me, who ever asked me how my day was and actually wanted the real answer. Grandma always says she'll never let me be alone, not for one single night. And I used to think that was just something old people say to make a kid feel better. But then I got here, to the clubhouse, and Curtis and the guys, they actually meant something like it too, in their own way. If something ever happens to me, and I don't mean to scare you, I just think about it sometimes on the bike. I don't want anybody standing over my grave who didn't really know me. I want Grandma there most of all, because she's the only person in my whole life who ever kept every single promise she made me, even the small ones, even when it would have been easier not to." Dorothy folded the letter back along its worn creases, with careful, practiced hands. "The night we buried him, I stood at that grave after everyone else had gone home, and I told him I'd never let him be alone. Not one night, not one, for as long as I was still breathing. That's the promise, Mr. Bradshaw." That's why I'm out here, and that's why I'll keep being out here, whatever the deputy says, whatever my son thinks." Curtis sat in silence for a long time after that, the cold air sharp in his lungs, unable to find a single word big enough for what he was feeling, something between grief and gratitude, and a fierce, protective anger on Dorothy's behalf that he hadn't expected to feel so strongly for a woman he'd known less than a month. 3 days later, everything nearly fell apart. Deputy Wallace arrived at the cemetery at 11 at night, flashlight sweeping across the grass, and cited Dorothy for trespassing after posted hours, informing her coldly, almost mechanically, that the county could pursue further legal action if the behavior continued, that he was doing her a favor with a warning citation instead of an arrest. The following morning, Richard Callahan, prompted by a phone call from a concerned neighbor who'd seen the citation mentioned online, filed an emergency petition in Davidson County Court, requesting a guardianship hearing to formally determine whether his mother was mentally fit to continue making decisions for herself. The hearing was set for the following Friday, giving everyone involved less than a week to prepare. When Curtis heard, relayed to him by Nathan Pierce over the phone that same afternoon, he went straight to the clubhouse and pulled Russell aside, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "They're trying to lock her away, Russell, for keeping a promise to a dead boy who loved us more than his own family did most days." Russell exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "You know what happens if we show up to that courthouse in force, Curtis. It's not going to look like support to a judge who doesn't know us. It's going to look like intimidation. 100 men in leather outside a county courthouse on the morning of a competency hearing. The judge might use it against her, might see it as exactly the kind of chaotic influence her son's lawyer is trying to argue she's surrounded by." Curtis looked at him hard, something settled and certain in his expression. "Then we make sure it doesn't look that way. But I am not letting that woman walk into that courtroom alone, Russell. Nobody in this club goes into anything alone, not while I'm president. That's the whole point of what we are, the whole reason Tyler ever wanted to be part of this in the first place." Friday morning arrived grey and cold, with a fine mist hanging over downtown Nashville, the kind of weather that made the whole city feel muted and waiting. Dorothy Callahan sat in the hallway outside courtroom 4B in a borrowed navy dress, her hands folded in her lap. Her son Richard seated 20 feet away on a hard wooden bench, refusing to meet her eyes, his own hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. She expected to face this alone. Her attorney, a tired but kind public defender named Miss Alvarado, had warned her the previous evening on the phone that guardianship hearings were often quick and unkind, that judges tended to side with caution when a petition came from immediate family with legitimate-sounding concerns about safety, that Dorothy shouldn't expect much sympathy in the room, beyond what Ms. Alvarado herself could argue on her behalf. At 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, the low rumble of motorcycle engines began rolling down the street outside the Justice A.A. Birch building. Dorothy heard it before she understood what it meant, a sound she'd grown almost fond of over the past weeks of Curtis's visits. By the time the courthouse security guards moved toward the front windows, radios crackling with confused questions, the sound had grown into something enormous. Dozens, then 100 motorcycles filling every available parking space and curb along the block, engines idling in perfect, deliberate unison, a wall of controlled sound that made pedestrians stop and stare from across the street. Then, at exactly 9:55, the engines cut off, all of them at once, as if on a single signal. 100 men and women in steel warden's colors dismounted in total silence and walked, single file, up the courthouse steps and through the metal detectors, removing their helmets as they entered, setting them beneath their arms like men and women attending a funeral rather than a fight. They did not chant, they did not shout or make a scene. They filed into the gallery of courtroom 4B and filled every available seat, standing quietly along the back wall 3 deep when the seats ran out, silent as a held breath. Silent in a way that unsettled the bailiff more than any noise could have. Curtis Bradshaw sat directly behind Dorothy, close enough that she could feel, for the first time in almost a year, that she was not facing this alone, that someone besides Nathan Pierce and a tired public defender was in her corner. Judge Patricia Owens entered and surveyed the packed courtroom with visible surprise, her eyes moving slowly over the wall of leather and quiet, weathered faces. But she said nothing beyond calling the case to order, her expression giving away nothing of what she thought about the unexpected gallery. Richard's attorney made his case first, methodical and clinical, that Dorothy Callahan, 74 years old, had been sleeping outdoors in a cemetery nightly for 7 consecutive months, had received a formal trespassing citation from the Metro Nashville Police Department, and was, in his precise legal language, engaging in behavior consistent with a significant decline in sound judgment following the traumatic and sudden loss of her grandson. He presented Dr. Ferris's chart notes about elevated blood pressure, a photograph of Dorothy asleep against the headstone taken by a concerned neighbor, and the citation itself as exhibits. When it was her turn, Ms. Alvarado called only one witness, Dorothy herself. Dorothy stood slowly, her hip aching with the movement, walked to the stand with careful, deliberate steps, and did something her own attorney had not planned for and hadn't rehearsed with her. She took Tyler's letter from her coat pocket, worn nearly translucent along its folds by now, and asked the judge's permission to read it aloud in full. The courtroom went utterly still, as her voice, thin but unwavering, filled the room with her grandson's words. About the club that waited up for him when his own home offered nothing but tension and disapproval. About a grandmother who never broke a promise, even the small ones. About wanting her there most of all at the end, because she was the only person who always kept her word. When she finished, no one moved for a long, suspended moment. Richard Callahan sat with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking silently, tears sliding down his face that he made no attempt to wipe away. Behind Dorothy, 100 hardened bikers, men and women who had buried brothers, weathered decades of being feared and misjudged, and crossed away from in nearly every town they ever rode through, sat in complete, stunned silence, many of them wiping their eyes with the backs of scarred, tattooed hands, a sight the bailiff would later describe to his wife as the strangest and most moving thing he'd witnessed in 11 years on the job. Curtis rose when the judge asked if anyone present wished to speak on Dorothy's behalf. He walked to the front of the courtroom with measured steps, and for the first time in 19 years of leading the Steel Wardens through funerals, fundraisers, and countless confrontations with police officers who assumed the worst of his club before ever learning their names, he found himself struggling to speak at all, his voice catching before he found his footing. "Your Honor," he finally said, "everybody in this town thinks they know what we are because of what we wear and what we ride. But Tyler Callahan wasn't raised by leather and engines, whatever his father's attorney wants this court to believe. He was raised, in every way that mattered most, by a woman who never once broke a promise to him, not even after he was gone from this world. If sleeping beside her grandson's grave to keep her word makes Dorothy Callahan unfit in the eyes of the law, then I honestly don't know what the rest of us, sitting in this room right now, are supposed to be considered instead." Judge Owens was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, folding her hands on the bench in front of her. "In 19 years on this bench," she said slowly, "I don't believe I have ever seen a courtroom go silent quite the way this one just did." She looked toward Richard, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Callahan, I don't doubt for a moment your concern for your mother's well-being, and I don't doubt that this past year has been devastating for your entire family. But I have heard nothing today that suggests impaired judgment on your mother's part, only grief expressed in an unconventional way, and a promise this family apparently understood far better through a letter written by a 19-year-old boy than through any conversation the two of you have had with each other since his death. She denied the guardianship petition. The ruling didn't fix everything. Grief doesn't work that way, and neither does 11 months of silence between a father and a son who never had the chance to make peace before it was too late. But it opened a door that had been sealed shut since the funeral, a door neither Dorothy nor Richard had known how to open on their own. Richard found his mother in the hallway after the hearing, the crowd of leather-clad strangers filing quietly past them toward the exit, and for the first time since Tyler's death, he didn't walk away from her. He sat down beside her on a courthouse bench, put his face in his hands, and asked her, voice breaking in a way she hadn't heard since he was a boy himself, to tell him everything she knew about the son he'd stopped trying to understand while he still had the chance to. Dorothy took his hand, her fingers cold from the morning air still clinging to them. "I'll tell you all of it," she said gently, "every bit I know. But you're going to have to come to the cemetery with me to hear it properly, the way it deserves to be told." He went with her that evening, hesitant at first, standing awkwardly at the fence line before finally walking through the gate. So did Curtis and Russell and a dozen other members of the Steel Wardens who had quietly become fixtures in Dorothy's life over the preceding weeks without her son ever knowing the full extent of it. Standing at Tyler's grave together, a grieving father learning to forgive himself, a grandmother who had never once broken her word, and the club that had loved his son when no one else in his life seemed to know how. Richard Callahan apologized for the first time in his life to people he had spent an entire year blaming for a tragedy that had never in any real sense been their fault. "I read that quote in the paper 100 times, Richard admitted quietly to Curtis, standing at the foot of his son's grave as the last light faded from the sky. "I told myself it made things simpler, easier to have somewhere to put it all. I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it better than that." "You don't have to say it better than that," Curtis told him. "You just have to keep saying it, to her, to yourself, for as long as it takes to feel true." The following month, the Steel Wardens raised money through a charity ride and installed a wooden bench beside Tyler's headstone, sturdy and weatherproofed against the Tennessee seasons, engraved simply along its backrest, "For Dorothy, who never left." They took turns after that, a rotating schedule Russell kept meticulously on a clipboard back at the clubhouse, 2 members every night sitting vigil alongside her so she was never again alone in the cold, and so she no longer had to sleep on frozen ground beneath a thin blanket to keep the promise she'd made almost a year earlier in the rawest hour of her grief. The town's opinion shifted slowly, the way opinions built on fear usually do, one conversation at a time, one act of witnessed kindness at a time, rarely all at once. Deputy Wallace, of all people, was among the first to change his mind about the club he'd once been so quick to cite and suspect. He stopped by the cemetery one evening off duty, out of uniform, and sat with Dorothy and 2 Steel Wardens members for nearly an hour, listening to stories about Tyler he'd never known. He left that night saying, to no one in particular, that he'd misjudged an entire group of people based on nothing more than the sound of their engines and the ink permanently marked into their skin, a judgment he'd carried without ever once questioning it until now. By the time winter fully settled over Nashville, frost thick on the grass every morning and the trees along the cemetery fence bare against grey skies, Dorothy Callahan was no longer the old woman the neighborhood whispered about on Facebook threads and front porches. She had become something else entirely in the eyes of Chester Avenue. Proof, walking proof, that the people a town had feared the most, judged the fastest, and understood the least turned out to be the ones who showed up when it mattered most, and that the woman everyone had quietly written off as broken had been, all along, the strongest and most faithful person any of them had ever had the privilege to know. She still visited the grave every evening, out of habit as much as devotion now. She no longer had to sleep there, not with the bench and the rotating company and her son beside her more often than not. But some nights, when the sky was clear and the stars sat low over the cemetery fence, Dorothy stayed until midnight anyway, sitting on the bench between Curtis and Russell, laughing at some story about her grandson that she'd never before had anyone left to share it with. Her son now listening quietly from the other end of the bench, learning his son one story at a time, one promise, keeper's memory at a time. She had kept her promise every single night of it, through frost and rain, and a courtroom that had nearly taken her away from it entirely. In the end, it turned out, so had they.